Hi, happy Monday. Welcome to the Wife of Caesar. I am Michel Levien or Michel Levien, either's fine. And as you know, the Wife of Caesar is Streiner's project where we try to discuss corruption, or rather anti-corruption, using everyday words, everyday language, so that we can fight corruption in our everyday lives with a little bit more than just good intentions. Awesome. So as always, we will have three sections. The first section deals with a piece of news that is related to corruption or anti-corruption. When the nexus is very evident, then we will only discuss its relevance. When it's not so clear how it's related to corruption, then we will try to explain why it's related and then explain how it's important. The second section deals with a case. We talk about cases that might be current or might be old, but that, again, are relevant to what we're trying to the point that we're trying to illustrate. And the third section deals with a typology where we explain the different ways in which one person can commit acts of corruption. Awesome. So let's move on to the news. Okay, so the news this week deals with the Organization of American States and how it's looking into different cases and evidence from different cases of corruption, of grand corruption in Venezuela. Now, before we move on, let's take a minute to explain what grand corruption is. As we know, corruption, broadly, corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for improper gain. Yeah. So if you are entrusted some power and you abuse it to generate improper benefits, then that's corruption. Awesome. Grand corruption is a bit trickier. It is corruption, but it involves violation of human rights and a certain amount of money. The damage has to be major. It is distinguished because grand corruption is considered to be more severe and therefore more antisocial, more unlikable, or more repugnant to society. And therefore is punished more harshly. So grand corruption, in order to know that you're facing grand corruption, you have to know that, of course, you have improper abuse of entrusted power for improper benefit. But that abuse has to entail violation of human rights to a major section of society or a major portion of society, a major social group. And that violation of human rights or the act of corruption has to generate damage to the state or to the affected group that is equal to or higher than 100 times the annual minimum subsistence income of its people. Now, annual, this is a mouthful, annual minimum subsistence income, is not equal to minimum wage, okay? Annual minimum subsistence income is the average income that a household receives over 1 year as published by unofficial figures by the government. So if the government says my average household, my average home receives an annual income of X dollars, then that is the annual minimum subsistence income. Now, when the act of corruption causes damage that is equal to 100 times 60% the value of the annual minimum subsistence income, then that is grand corruption. So you take the income, you multiply it by 0.6, and then you multiply that amount by 100, and you get somewhere around maybe $5,000-$6,000 US. And if the damage caused by the crime or the act of corruption is equal to or greater than that amount, then you're facing grand corruption. So that was very confusing to everyone involved. Let's recap a little bit. We have corruption. Great. Well, not great, but we have an act of corruption. That act of corruption entails violation to human rights. So, for example, depriving a population of drinking water, like Flint. And the damage caused to the state or to the population exceeds 100 times the annual minimum subsistence income of those people, then you have grand corruption. And it's a more severe crime. It's a grave crime, and there are efforts worldwide to actually incorporate that crime into the category of crimes against humanity. So it's a very bad criminal act. Okay, so now that we know what grand corruption is, what is the Organization of American States trying to do? They are trying to figure out whether or not the crimes committed by Maduro and by his regime are severe enough so that they can pressure other countries into opposing the regime of Maduro and eventually favoring Guaido as a president and aiding Venezuela in this humanitarian crisis. Also, additionally, they are trying to build a case or get material to eventually build a case for more severe crimes, such as crimes that carry universal jurisdiction, like crimes against humanity and other things like that. Great, so let's move on to the case. Today we discuss MTS, or Mobile Telesystems. Mobile Telesystems is the largest cell phone service carrier in Russia. So in Russia, the biggest cell phone company. Great. Now, what did they do? Well, over the course of last month, they agreed to pay a fine of $850 million to the SEC, that is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice, or DOJ, both of the US. Okay, what's going on? So MTS does business in Russia, right? They provide cell phone service in Russia. But they also do business elsewhere. They do business in different countries. And two of those countries are the US and Uzbekistan. Now, when you do business with the US or in the US, many things happen. But one of the things that happens is that your company or your business becomes subject to the jurisdiction of the US. Okay, having said that, this company went out of Russia to do business, obviously, in the US and in Uzbekistan. And between the years 2004 and 2012, it started or allegedly started paying bribes to public officials in Uzbekistan to gain access to the country's radio spectrum. Allegedly, the company paid about $420 million in bribes. Now, they did this through different charities and through a very complex scheme of currency exchange. And if you want to know how you pay bribes through a charity, then you can always look to the previous video where we explain that. We will link it down below, and so check that out. Okay, so the company paid bribes to a public official in Uzbekistan between 2004 and 2012 for $400 million. Allegedly, the company made over $2.4 billion with the business that it corruptly gained. Okay, so the company is being charged with 3 separate crimes. Now, this is kind of tricky because it's not just the crime of paying a bribe. Again, they do business in the US, so they fall under the jurisdiction of the US, so they have to obey certain laws in the US. Great. The anti-corruption or anti-bribery laws in the US are very specific. So it is a crime to go to another country and pay a bribe, which we've already established they did. So that's crime 1. But it's also a crime to go to the country, pay a bribe, and disguise that bribe in your accounting records as something else. This is what we call the books and records provision. And when you do that, you are in effect lying to the government. You are claiming that you did something right when you actually did something wrong, and that was so wrong that it's a crime, the crime of bribery. Okay, so that's crime 2. Violation of the books and records provisions. And crime 3 this is kind of tricky. Companies like MTS have the obligation to implement or to establish in use compliance programs. Compliance programs, sometimes called integrity policies, different names, but essentially they are systems within your company that help prevent corruption. Great. The laws of the US make it mandatory for companies to use these systems. And when you don't do that, you are committing the crime of failing to implement a compliance program. So that's crime 3. So essentially, MTS is being charged for not having an anti-corruption system, not preventing corruption, actually committing corruption, and then hiding corruption. And again, it's being charged $850 million as a fine. Now, this is tricky. These fines are huge by our standards, right? But for these companies, this is nothing, or this is a relatively small amount. What's tricky here is that the US, like most of the other countries that punish foreign bribery, are subject to the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. It's just an international agreement that says we will punish foreign bribery. Okay, but the convention states that penalties for bribery have to be effective, proportional, and dissuasive. Essentially, if you're going to punish someone for committing the crime of international or foreign bribery, that punishment has to be tailor-made to the conditions so that that person and other people are dissuaded and don't want to pay a bribe, don't want to go out and commit the crime of bribery. Okay? Generally, this means that the fine that you pay is bigger than the benefit you obtain. But here, again, to recap, MTS pays $420 million in bribes, receives a fine for $850 million for the bribery, but it made over $2.4 billion in profits. Now, is this effective, proportional, and dissuasive? I would say no on face value. At face value, we would have to, of course, this might be nuanced. We would have to look at the investigations and the different types of evidence that the authorities managed to gather. But I feel that this falls under the category of a punishment that is not effective, is not proportional, and is not dissuasive. Okay, so let's move on to the typology. As you know, typologies, as we always discuss, typologies are specific examples or specific models of a phenomenon. In our case, when we talk about a typology for corruption, we talk about the different specific ways in which one person can commit an act of corruption. And today we will talk about straw men and straw companies and how straw men are used. When you commit an act of corruption, when you commit a crime, your goal is to, yes, make a profit, but also to hide those profits, to make those profits look like they are legitimate so that you can use the money in, the real world with alongside actual honest people, which you really shouldn't, but, it happens. Okay. One of the devices that one of the tricks or one of the tools that the corrupt use to hide that money are straw men. Straw men are people who hold property only in name, but don't really own things. Okay, so let's say that I am the governor of a state and I steal maybe $4 billion and I want to use that money, but I can't have it under my own name, right? Because I'm a public person or a politically exposed person. So I put that money or in assets under the name of a friend. That friend effectively becomes my straw man. He or she owns it, but only on paper, only in name. But the real owner, the beneficial owner, is me, the person who actually gets to use the things or use the assets. That has been done for many, many years. And one of the more sophisticated ways in which people do this nowadays is by using shell companies, or sometimes called straw companies, or sometimes called ghost companies, or sometimes called shelf companies. No, straw companies. It's a whole thing. A tool that is most often used and has been used widely is Panamanian companies, Panamanian corporations. Now, you might remember from hearing about the Panama Papers in the news. The Panama Papers where it's essentially, the short version is that it's a big scandal because a law firm in Panama was incorporating companies for the corrupt, for money launderers, for terrorists, for criminals. And these companies, under the laws of Panama, you don't have to declare who is the owner of a company, who is the shareholder of a company. You just declare that the shares exist and that the owner is the person who physically holds the stock certificates. So they are bearer stock certificates. Great. People use this because they want to hide the proceeds of crime. So let's say, again, I'm a governor of a state and I steal $4 billion and I transfer those assets to a Panamanian company, and that Panamanian company is owned by, whoever holds the deed. And it's very hard to track because the law actually, the law from Panama actually prohibits the companies and the firms from revealing who the actual owners are. But let's take it a step further. Let's say that I really, really want to be good about hiding my assets. So I go to a lawyer in Austria and I tell him, oh, okay, so I already went to Panama and I have my shell company. Great. I take that shell company, that shell company goes to Austria and talks to an Austrian lawyer and says, I want to incorporate what is known as a Troy hand trust or a true hand trust. A true hand trust is just a regular trust. You give an asset to a trustee, essentially a bank, and that trustee does something with your assets, invests money or manages property or whatever. In this case, the company from Panama, an anonymous company from Panama, gives assets to a trustee in Austria to create, again, a Troy hand trust. And the thing about Troy hand trusts is that the Austrian law actually forbids trustees from revealing who the actual owners or the beneficiaries of trusts are. So if, let's say, an investigating authority or even an Austrian judge were to go before the financial entity and say, tell me who benefits from this trust. They are legally forbidden from doing that. So if we have our very, very corrupt politician from Mexico, and he or she takes the money to Panama and creates a Panama shell company, and that shell company goes to Austria and creates a trust, and that trust manages the stolen assets, it's very, very hard to track who is the owner and from where the assets come. This is why it's very important to use financial audits or forensic audits in tracking acts of corruption, and essentially what's known as following the money. It's very hard to perform an investigation when people use this type of instrument. So what we do is we reverse engineer financial operations. Okay, so that was it for today. I hope you found it interesting. Again, my name is Michel Levien or Michel Levien, either's fine. If you have questions, write us, let us know here on YouTube, find us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, I'd like to tell you that all acts of corruption should be reported. So if you come across an act of corruption or what you think is corruption, do go ahead, blow the whistle, let the authorities know, but only do it if you feel safe. If you don't know whether or not you're safe or whether or not what you're witnessing is an actual act of corruption, feel free to drop us a line at info@streiner.mx, and we would be glad to help you in any way we can. But above everything, stay safe. Okay, so that was it. Thank you for joining us in the Wife of Caesar, and we'll see you next week.